Welcome to this installment of Brave New World on ContextTV. Today we're going to take a look at all the job losses we're seeing in the media industry and try to make sense of it all. How does that relate compared to the broader economy, where in the US by now you've seen 17 million people lose their jobs, and in Canada well over 1 million. We're talking about 50,000 jobs when you combine tech and media. So I wanted to put that in context. You can blame the duopoly all you want. I think bashing Google and Facebook is almost like a Olympic sport when it comes to media analysts. But I think if you really want to kind of look at the pickle that media companies find themselves in, it's important to go through history and identify that the root of the power of media companies, the newspapers, was always in the classifieds business. And then that was the product. And then in terms of like the marketplace, they were ultimately monopolies. If you read at the history of advanced publications, Condé Nast, Hearst newspapers, New York Times, etc., it was always this company that ultimately had barriers to entry that they benefited from, and they would basically consolidate market share in a given region. And the advertising revenue, mainly driven through classifieds, would basically allow them to have these newsrooms that were, paid, great jobs, great salaries, and management would kind of have a good life, so to speak. And over the course of generations and decades, these companies got fat, and these legacy models made a lot of sense in that monopoly of classified revenue, in a given market where they were the only game in town. So with the power of Google, Facebook, obviously Craigslist, the local monopoly buffer moat was evaporated. It went away. And so some companies reacted to that really quickly. Others were very slow. And the mere fact that, this has been covered quite a bit, the mere fact that newspapers never really positioned themselves wisely in terms of search and community tools and classifieds online, and let others run with those markets, eventually eroded their power base. And each time you had a shock to the system, things accelerated. So in 2000, when the NASDAQ blew up and the dot-com bubble burst, in the near term, the traditional legacy companies benefited because the dot-com companies just went by the wayside. But in 2008, it basically hurt the print companies, and they never really recovered from that. And in many ways, 2020 is just going to accelerate that. And I think that's why you're seeing so many news companies get nailed, because so much of the local industries are being shut down, the restaurants, the live entertainment, the dealerships, all of the typical people that would be advertising have been basically forced to pause operations because of physical social distancing. But then, so that's part of it, right? So then why is it that there are all these jobs that are being lost, and then these furloughs and salaries? I think you got to now look at the democratization of media production, distribution. So obviously we built a business on YouTube. We were a challenger 10, 15 years ago, and admittedly I've alluded to this, the fact that Viacom sued Google, YouTube, and they chose not to have a presence on YouTube. That created a vacuum where we could create lists that people would have historically seen on VH1, and we basically built market share because others didn't want to embrace that. And that democratization of media is why we could do that out of our kind of garage, so to speak, and build a company. And I think what you've seen is literally anybody could write a blog, can write an article, and with video, anybody could, in theory, build a media company where it's no longer, let alone a monopoly, but there's no real barriers to entry. You don't need a printing press, you don't need a cable license. And so if you put all of these factors together and then amplified and accelerated with the coronavirus, you've seen it. I mean, sometimes I'll meet people, executives at these traditional media companies, and there's a vice president, and then there's like an SVP and an EVP, and I don't really know what each one does. And to be honest with you, I think the CFO and the CEO also doesn't know what these people do. But you can't ask them to leave, right? And this is not going to be very PC, but setting aside like the personal side of it, I think what Corona is going to do is basically say, look, out of those three people, maybe one of them ends up sticking around in 18 months, right? So at first, you don't want to make any rash decisions. You basically go up to all of those people and you say, look, let's just take a 10%, 20%, 30%, 50% salary cut, and we'll figure it out. But COVID will take a long time to recover. The economy isn't going to just, there's no flip of a switch where things come back. Eventually, companies are just going to have to make that tough decision, and you're going to see this acceleration of an exodus of, more tenured executives. And you've already seen that. You've already seen that in ad agencies in many places where executives have left, either because they were burnt out and had post-traumatic stress disorder, their words when I talk to them. They're like, yeah, I didn't want to live in that corporate world anymore. But also because a lot of them grew over decades in these eras in traditional media companies where it was fat times, and it was fine to have these big salaries, big overhead, and it was all good. And I think the reality now of the duopoly and everything else makes that harder. And then if you see what's happened with the rise, because there's no barriers to entry, the rise of what I call these storytelling entrepreneurs. At the extreme, you have the PewDiePie, the Hank brothers, myself and Watch Mojo, and many others who basically were good enough storytellers, good enough entrepreneurs, and they recognized a vacuum, married their passion to it, and built a business without needing all the overhead. And frankly, even though we went through our period where we recruited these executives who were more tenured, as much as they're great individuals, we also realized that it takes a different skill set, and especially with the rise of programmatic advertising, which, like classifieds, built all of the media industry. It's a lot less about your Rolodex and relationships, and it's a lot more about audience and performance, right? So we've seen this like seismic tectonic shifts over the course of the last couple decades, and COVID it's like this asteroid that is hurled into a lake. It just disrupts anything. And then finally, again, not very, I'm not saying this to be to show a lack of sensitivity, but just to be kind of realistic with people. Media has always drawn a lot of people, English, communications, liberal arts, all different walks of life and, degrees. People like to talk, they like to communicate. Storytelling has always been something that's like a sexy, job that people like. But if you go back to the reality of this democratization of media, from the earliest, blog software to just writing up, anything and publishing it on LinkedIn or Facebook and with YouTube, there's just way too many people in this industry who don't want to accept that reality, that there are a lot of people waiting and eager in the wings to do that job almost for free, and then eventually they obviously want to get paid and get paid more and more, and that cycle continues. So the demand and supply dynamics we're always going to lead us to the situation where, frankly, you don't need as many writers, you don't need as many content creators. And I'm a content creator, I publish books, I'm a columnist, right? So I'm not saying this from the business side of it, but just recognizing that, well, yeah, there's a lot of people who are willing to do that for free. And now with Corona affecting revenue so dramatically, so sharply, it was kind of like a fait accompli that you were going to need a lot less creatives and editorial. But also on the business side, for decades and years, you didn't really want to make those tough cuts, and now you realize there is a lot of redundancy. So I think what you are seeing now is all of these major trends that have been simmering for literally decades come together all at once, and it's just going to be accelerating the exodus and the democratization of media.